Good morning. I'm Chairman Don Palmer with the United States Election Assistance Commission. Earlier this year, the President issued an executive order on promoting access to voting. And as part of this order, the EAC was charged to support a variety of federal agencies as they gather information and develop strategies to improve access. Our conversation today will focus on voting accessibility challenges and technology solutions for voters with disabilities. Collecting and sharing best practices for accessible voting is an important part of the EAC's work, and we are happy to contribute to this effort. Today, I'm pleased to speak with David Dively, the Executive Director for the Minnesota Council on Disability, Lou Ann Blake, the Director of Research Programs for the National Federation of the Blind, and Dr. Jay Bagga and Dr. Bryan Byers, co-directors for Ball State University's Voting System Technical Oversight Program, otherwise known as VSTOP. Thank you all for joining me today for this discussion. To start the discussion, I'd like each of you to describe some of the feedback that you have on the challenges and successful technology solutions that you've received from your members and voters with disabilities. Thank you. Let's start with Dr. Dively.
Hi, and thank you for coming. It's an honor to be here. Overwhelmingly, I think we did receive some positive feedback this last election. So I think I'll start by kind of bearing the, leading with the lead there. But I will say that there were a few specific things that we got, particularly as it comes to HAVA-related things, proper signage, accessible pathways to locations of voting. But honestly, the number one thing that we heard so far actually was the level of expertise or information that poll workers or election judges, as they're called in Minnesota, were aware of the rights of people with disabilities for voting, particularly how they could do it independently, safely, and anonymously. That was by far the biggest barrier that we experienced. And then later on, I can share some of the ways we worked to support some of those initiatives as well.
Great. Lou Ann, what are your thoughts on that, on some of the challenges and solutions that you've received?
Sure. Thank you, Chairman Palmer. I appreciate the invitation. So blind voters face a number of barriers, both in-person voting and when voting by mail. In-person voting, it's not uncommon for a blind voter to show up at their polling place and find out that the accessible ballot marking device hasn't been set up. And frequently this is because the poll workers don't know how to set up the machine or operate the machine. So this means that they have to wait around while the poll workers try and figure it out how to set up the machine and get it set up. We've conducted a survey of blind voters for every presidential election since 2008. And for the 2020 election, 25% of our survey participants said that the machine was not set up when they arrived at the polling place. That's a slight improvement over 2016 when it was 33% of the voters said that it was not set up. So there was some improvement there, which is really good. There are a number of other issues that blind voters face. A lot of that has to deal with how the machines are designed. The ballot that they produce may be different from in size and content from the hand-marked ballot. They may not be able to verify independently the ballot when it has been printed. So there are a number of technology issues surrounding the machines themselves. And I know in Georgia, they actually permitted blind voters to use an OCR app on a smartphone to verify their ballot. So that's, one way that technology can help to solve that problem.
Lou Ann, could you talk a little bit about more of that OCR app and how that was used? That was in, you said?
Sure, it was in Georgia. So an OCR app, optical character recognition, is an app that you can have on your smartphone. And what it does, it takes a picture of the ballot. And as long as the ballot is designed so it just includes the names of the contest and then the selected candidate, will read that text to the voter, once it's taken the picture of the ballot. If it's a ballot that's designed to look more like the hand-marked ballot where it shows a bubble filled in, then that's not going to work so well. It'll just read off, it'll do a really nice job of reading the title of the contest and then all the candidates, but it doesn't recognize the filled in bubble. So a lot of it depends on how the ballot is designed, on how well those OCR apps will work.
So you received some feedback that sort of technology worked for some members of the community in Georgia.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, it did.
Okay. Do you know any other states that do that? I think I might have heard California. Are there other states that also use that technology that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of it. So part of the problem is that, state law won't permit people to take a photo of their ballot. So I know in Georgia, they had to enact some kind of special election rule to permit blind voters to use their phones and OCR apps. So that's, another barrier that it's preventing technology from being used.
So sometimes it's state law that's the barrier.
Right.
Okay, obviously. Dr. Bagga, Dr. Byers, do you have any input on this? You see it from a little bit of different perspective, but from your position, there was a mention of, challenges of the technology with voting systems, for example. What are some of the challenges that you see and some potential solutions from BSOP's perspective?
Thank you. I'll say a few words first, and then Dr. Byers, I'll invite him. Thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel, Chairman Palmer, and good morning, everyone. VSTOP has been in existence now for about 15 years, since 2006, around then. I've been associated as a co-director with VSTOP since the very beginning. Dr. Byers joined us in 2017. One of our main activities is to assist the state of Indiana in certifying voting systems as well as electronic poll books. And we are proud to say we are one of the first states that developed a protocol for testing of electronic poll books, certification and testing. And of course, there are some accessibility issues in electronic poll books too for poll workers and such. But certainly for voting systems is where majority of our effort has been. Since the very beginning, as we test these voting systems and make recommendations to the Indiana Election Division and the Indiana Election Commission, a 4-member body that approves systems for certification in Indiana. The Indiana law, of course, incorporates the VVSG accessibility requirements into its code, but also there are some on top of that, and we follow those, and they are updated as VVSG is. So, of course, Indiana law requires that each voting location have equipment for voters with disabilities. What we've done in our test, and part of our testing is a field test that we bring the equipment from the vendors into Ball State and do a 1 or a 2-day field test. We bring in an expert in disability related matters. And this we have 2 experts that we work with, and they are both experts in assistive technologies. They themselves have some handicaps. So they are very used to, one of them is blind and other one has disability, he's on a wheelchair. And so they are both experts, and we use them as our experts for testing. And that's turned out to be very good because they exactly know what to test. So we do a functional test of the voting systems, and we also do a mock election where we ask these experts to test all the voting technologies for disabled. And we can talk more about those details later. We are actually in the process of updating our protocol that we use for voting systems. And a big part of that is an appendix on accessibility testing, which we will recommend to the Indiana Election Division. Upon their approval, we'll share it with the vendors, and there'll be a period of comment. And we expect that that'll go into force sometime this fall. All of our voting systems, including all the disability-related features, all the voting systems are due to expire on October 1st of this year. In Indiana, voting system certifications expire in the year after the presidential election year. So that's a 4-year cycle. Up to 4 years is what a voting system has. So we are going to be busy this year around October. And the accessibility features will certainly be a big part of our tests. And we can talk about more details. Dr. Byers?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be here, Chairman Palmer and everyone else. That was an excellent overview of the accessibility matters that we address in VSTOP. The only thing I would add to Dr. Bagga's comments is that the accessibility testing is part of the bigger field test that we do here on campus, where the vendor brings in equipment and is put through the paces. And there is a protocol for the accessibility testing that's part of the larger protocol for the field test. And the equipment has to meet the expectations and satisfy our expert and us in order for us to give a positive recommendation in our report to the Indiana Election Commission for potential certification in order for it to be considered. So it's a very important, so I just really want to emphasize that extremely important part of what we do in the certification process, and everything we do is HAVA-based, HUBA-based, and Indiana election code based. Thank you.
Mr. Dively, you want to comment on that? I think that it's really important, and we may have to flush out a bit. You know, when we test for accessibility, in some ways, we're also testing for usability. We want to make sure it works as designed in an accessible manner. And then how do you develop those standards for accessibility? So what are we testing to? And I'll probably come back to the VSTOP team in a minute, but I wanted to give you and Mr. Blake a chance to talk about how we could do testing for accessibility for non-voting systems right now, or voting systems. And do you have any thoughts on that? How federal agencies could do a better job with that?
Yeah, thank you. And I would say that Ms. Blake spoke to a lot of the things that we heard as well in her opening comments. So I think that was well explained. You know, some of the biggest barriers that we saw were honestly from folks who were either deaf-blind, or blind, visually impaired, or blind low vision, depending on how they choose to identify. And basically, we've at the state level enacted a requirement that even an automated accessible ballot must have the same dimensions as Ms. Blake mentioned about the discrepancies that can exist. And of course, if you have, for example, a very small number of people who are blind or deafblind in your precinct, it's actually essentially not anonymous then, because they stand alone as a different type of ballot. We've actually moved to this kind of second level now, where the automated printed version of that ballot is so perfect that there are no kind of manual inaccuracies in the circling of the bubble and things like that, that it becomes so pristine that it actually still remains a barrier despite having the exact same dimensions as a regular ballot, that if someone were to look at it and audit it, they could determine that that was created by an accessible voting machine printout. So we aren't entirely sure how to resolve that issue other than some kind of, algorithm to generate some kind of inaccuracies intentionally to make it a little bit anonymized. That is one of the main issues. I'll echo again what Ms. Blake said about equipment that exists in theory on site, but not necessarily usable in practice. And I would say that has to do typically with our local precincts, which is difficult to control at the federal level. But some precincts may not encounter a person who uses an accessible ballot the entire election cycle. So the degree to which they're trained is really varied. And so what we've noticed is that a lot of the training materials for voters and for election judges is not accessible itself, which creates barriers for access to voting. including whether it's captioning, interpreting, audio description, etc. And then I would echo Minnesota is a state that does not allow photographs of your ballot, that people with disabilities are in a position where they have to essentially, we do allow them to bring a support service provider with them to vote. However, they depend on someone else to essentially validate that their ballot is accurate and they're voting for the candidate to whom they're intending to vote for. And that in a way is an improvement as opposed to like an election staffer, right, that does that role. But it's still not truly independent. So it's almost as if there needs to be this. We have the speech to text and text to speech within the device for filling out the ballot, but the validation of the ballot, as far as I'm aware, is not consistent. And then in Minnesota specifically, we have different models that are used across the state. And so we have not equivalent levels of accessibility depending on the county in which you live. So some of that kind of federalization is a challenge that we experience. And then lastly, I'll just say that we have one particular issue for the signing deaf community, for which the poll workers typically do not have a sign language interpreter present, on standby. And so there's communication barriers upon trying to register to vote or to vote on election day. And there's a lack of resources. And so the Minnesota Commission for the Deaf, Blind, and Hard of Hearing partnered with our Secretary of State to create a special, essentially video call phone number that would be direct to a worker that was specialized in accessibility law, particularly for the deaf and hard of hearing community, that could address any information and technical barriers they were experiencing using sign language to a person who also uses sign language. And so there were things that we demoed in the 2020 election that seemed to go well to reduce barriers for people voting.
So Mr. Dively, let me ask you a couple questions on that, because we've heard that's a repeated thing, and it's been going, I think we've heard that often the accessible equipment may be in the precinct, but not ready to go or set up, or the poll workers are not trained appropriately for when a voter with a disability appears. And I guess my question is this a matter of training and communication prior to an election? What do you see as a solution to that? More training specifically on that? Maybe, a lot of equipment is delivered the night of, or the night before, the morning of, or the night before an election. Perhaps there needs to be, more time to ensure that those systems are set up prior to an election. But what do you think are some of the solutions to that problem of poll workers just not having the equipment ready to go?
Yeah, so we've attacked it kind of from two different angles. So the first is to have a county worker that is kind of quote unquote in charge of securing the device and actually bringing it to the community for them to use in advance of an election, testing out the text to speech, testing out the accessible voting functionality of it in a non-voting capacity, but just getting really familiar with the system as they change county to county, of course, so if they move, it might be a new device for them. So there's a lack of familiarity on the voter side. So I think that shouldn't be overlooked. And that was effective. And we got lots of good feedback to the vendors and to the election officials. On the other side, I'll say that I think that Minnesota runs a really nice election system, and it's not disparaging, and I don't mean it in that way. But I would say that because we primarily depend on essentially a volunteer system, that the level of information and expertise is quite the range across election workers. And so I think that if we can manage to do it in a secure way, ensuring that they're implemented and set up in advance, particularly the accessible machines, if maybe not necessarily the entire setup, but that would be one opportunity. But it would still remain that when it comes time to actually use it, the election judges need to be aware that isn't even an option for people to use. And so what the end result is that it becomes incumbent on people with disabilities to really know their rights and self-advocate on the spot. And so And that's really the opposite direction that we want to go in, right? We really want it to be accessible without barriers and without people having to self-advocate for rights that already exist. So, and maybe Ms. Blake has some things to add here as far as usability and that perspective, but typically in my experience, it's come down to training, and whether it's the election judge or the election official that leads that precinct or the frontlines workers, but there's so much to absorb and train on that this kind of seems to kind of fall off the plate, so to speak. And so that's the number one area that I would focus on.
You know, Luann, before I let you jump in here, you know, I think that I never really quite understood why this continued to happen. You know, I was in a couple of states, and not everything is a federal law, but this is sort of a federal requirement on a couple of different levels. And so not having the systems ready to go and not being prepared for those systems is really unacceptable. Yet we continue to see that, even though these are federal guidelines, which not everything in a polling place is required by state law or federal law. So there is a wide variety of ways that elections can be conducted inside a polling place, for example, but these are some minimal requirements that are just required. And it's been an issue since I've been in the community, and you know, train seems to be the solution. What do you think, Luann, about this? And do you have do you agree with those potential solutions of more training, or do you have any other ideas on the matter?
Yeah, training has always been and continues to be, unfortunately, an issue. I think part of the problem is that poll workers get training well in advance of the election. So by the time the election rolls around, they've kind of forgotten, you know, about the accessible ballot marking device and how to set it up and how it works. Some of the things that we recommend is, you know, having at least one person in every polling place, at least one poll worker who has additional training on the ballot marking device, so that they really understand how to set it up, how it works, how the accessibility features work. I think that's one way that maybe we can, you know, improve on the situation. Another suggestion is election officials need to do a better job. I know they have a hard job. I know they have a lot to do, but they really need to work a little harder on reaching out to the disability community to recruit people with disabilities to be poll workers. I think, you know, what better person to have in charge of the accessible ballot marking device than someone who has a vested interest in that machine being up and running. You know, someone who really knows how it works, someone who uses it to vote. I think that, you know, would be a good way to maybe help resolve this issue that continues to plague us. Another kind of bigger issue is that we have a segregated voting system in most jurisdictions in this country now. The majority of voters are hand marking their ballots, while just a few people are using the accessible ballot marking device. So there's less incentive on the part of the poll workers to really know the machine and how to set it up and how it works. I think if we had more people using the machine, it would be more likely that it would be set up. You know, we've even advocated for making the accessible ballot marking device the primary method of ballot marking. I think there would be a lot less incidence of the ballot marking device not being set up if that was the primary method of ballot marking. So there's a number of ways that I think we can attack this problem. And I think, you know, we need to focus more on getting those solutions implemented.
So let's shift a little bit to another topic. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about voting systems, EPBs, and sort of the groundwork of training for poll workers. Let's shift back to technology a bit. You know, are there technology gaps or sort of challenges that are out there. And I know, Luann, you're always interested in the cutting edge on these issues. And I think obviously the other panelists are as well. What gaps are out there, and what sort of resources would need to fill those gaps from a research perspective? Is there something that the federal government or the EAC could do to develop certain technologies to help with those gaps? And I know it's a little bit of a complicated question. That's why I'm asking you if you have any, anything out there that you think could be, researched to develop new technologies.
Well, I'll jump in on that. So current in-person voting is really not fully accessible for deafblind voters. A polling place tends to be a noisy environment, and frequently a deafblind voter cannot get the volume loud enough for them to really be able to hear what the audio ballot is telling them, what it's saying. So unfortunately, a lot of times they kind of end up guessing, and hoping that they're actually selecting the correct candidate. So, so certainly something needs to be done to make ballot marking devices accessible for deafblind voters. And some of it's got to do with the polling place, and how the machine is set up and where it's set up and, things like that. But the machine itself, some research needs to be done on how to make those machines more accessible for deafblind. And I don't, if there's some way that we can, incorporate refreshable braille into the machines, that certainly would be an effective way to solve that. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, verifying the ballot once it's printed, is an issue. And as well as, Mr. Dively talked about, the ballot itself and the appearance of the ballot. And so research needs to be done on how ballots can be produced by an accessible ballot marking device that is not going to be, say, hey, I've been printed by an accessible ballot marking device. So those are, I think, for in-person voting are kind of the main areas that I think where, some research could be done.
Thank you for that. Dr. Bagga, Dr. Byers, I'm going to go back a little bit to the previous conversation we had. I want to ask you, how do you test to confirm, the accessibility standards that you've developed in your voting or election systems? I mean, tell me how you develop those standards, and how can a federal testing program on election systems test for accessibility in a similar way? I know it's probably a big question, but if you're able to answer it, I'd be grateful.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to address a couple of challenges related to your question, Don. And going back to the discussion we had about voting systems as well as non-voting systems such as EPBs. So as we mentioned, we have a protocol for EPBs, and now we know that EAC is interested in this activity, this area, as in the state certification conference. Don, you made that presentation about, and we've been talking about what Indiana has done. So I want to mention a couple of issues and challenges on which some research and testing would be useful. And we have also noticed that one would be for EPBs, what kind of features should be tested for accessibility related voters. Now, voters do not directly interact with EPBs as they do with voting systems, for example. It's the poll workers who handle the EPBs, but when a voter checks in, and as Luann mentioned, it's a great idea to recruit poll workers who are themselves accessibility challenged. I think that's a great goal we should have. We should bring in poll workers who themselves face this. I think it'll be great to train them to handle, to manage the voters with disabilities. So for example, when a voter checks in, the poll worker will turn the screen around on EPB, let's say a tablet, to have their name on the display and ask the voter, is that your current name and address? And sometimes they'll just recite that. Other times they will have the voter look at the screen. Now, so there are certainly interesting questions for a disabled voter on how that could be accomplished for the check-in phase. That's one. The other challenge we are facing for voting systems is for absentee voters. There's a law in Indiana that when absentee ballot is mailed out to voters, it should have the bipartisan signatures to make sure the ballot is sent out. And so a voter is required to check that the ballot has been signed by the bipartisan team before it's mailed out. Well, how do you make that happen for disabled voters? How do they check to see? So those are some of the interesting challenges we face. Now, going back to your question about how we test these and how we develop the protocol, we of course started out with BBSG requirements and the state requirements. And what we've done is, and we'll be happy to share a copy of our protocol with you and with this group. We have categorized the questions into a number of different categories related to, for example, blindness, dexterity, being able to do audio ballots and such. So in each category, we have a number of questions that we ask of the vendor. Our expert does that. And the vendor is required to demonstrate those features to us. And then our expert will actually use those features on the machine that's available to us during the field test and try to vote using those features. And that all those there's a checklist of all these features that we go through, and a successful test result would be where all of the features have been met. So let me stop there and ask Dr. Byers to add to that.
Actually, I don't have anything to add to that. Thank you.
So my next question is sort of a general question, unless there's some feedback, anything from Mr. Dively or Luann on that topic.
I'll jump in here. This is
Sure.
David here. Yeah, I think, having, I'll be honest, I'm a little bit split here on having a dedicated person and a dedicated machine. So, one of the things that we try to do and advocate and lobby for is universal design, right? So it's not designing two separate systems that one address folks without disabilities, one with disabilities, whether it's websites or government service programs or anything else, but it's from the beginning integrated in a way that creates a cohesive and unified system that is universal for everybody, right? Whether it's curb cuts or whatever the case may be. This is a barrier for people with disabilities right now, as Ms. Blake mentioned. So if we were to say, so-and-so one individual at a certain precinct would be a subject matter expert, that would maybe in practical terms really be beneficial, but it also reinforces this kind of segregated nature of who's responsible, quote unquote, for ensuring accessibility. And we would really advocate for it to be the whole enterprise, from the Secretary of State or whatever office is in charge in that state, all the way down to the boots on the ground at the county level, and not one person per precinct. So there's some philosophical challenges there. When it's come to having election officials working in the front lines with disabilities in Minnesota, there's only been a few so far that have tried, but they've run into significant barriers about who pays for those accommodations. Is it the party if they're a caucus representative? Is it the county? Is it the location in which the election takes place? We've had a few deaf signing individuals, I think maybe one blind individual. So there are some logistical challenges that have come from it. But in a way, this is kind of analogous to having like a manager who's really good at supervising employees with disabilities. Well, we really want all managers to be effective at working and employing people with disabilities, not one excellent person in each organization. So there's some philosophical challenges there that could be considered, but at a practical level, it would dramatically increase the awareness of people that work with that person if there was someone with a disability at that poll place that worked the poll place. I know some family members of mine with disabilities who have done election judge work, and after some self-advocacy about accommodations, they've been able to get those in place and then be effective in that role. I would say that the accessibility voting advisory council, if you were to call it that, that we have at the state has, and each secretary of state has different prerogatives and different priorities, but those instruments have been really effective in Minnesota, depending on the secretary of state, to increase accessibility at the voting location. So those kinds of state level, because a lot of this is state, governed, or county level governed. So the more of these accessibility advisory committees that can be put into place among folks with disabilities and advocates for people with disabilities, those can really push those state level protocols in the right direction that wouldn't be under federal purview.
So the question I was going to ask is, so in the past, the EAC has had some grants and led some research efforts and development efforts in accessible voting. Are there some R&D issues that you believe we should be analyzing moving forward, if provided the funding? We'll start with you, Luann, and then we'll see if there's any input.
Sure. I think I sort of addressed this a little earlier. Again, just kind of reiterating that. As I was saying, deaf-blind voters, there really is no accessible ballot marking device that works really well for them. And so if there is, some research on how they can, maybe connect their hearing aids to the system, or some way that refreshable braille could be incorporated. I believe there's been some research by some folks into that area, but if there's some way that could be done and still, securely, of course, that would really be beneficial to those voters. And the ballots themselves, how machines are research on the ballots so that the machines would print ballots that are truly not distinguishable from the hand-marked ballot. That's an area where there's need for improvement. Of course, verifying the ballot once it's printed is another area where that's not done very well at the moment by most of the ballot marking devices currently available. So those are three areas where I think there really needs to be some work done.
So it's sort of related to that, but we've had a couple, we find that accessible voting pilots across the states sometimes achieve some very positive results and for voters with disabilities. And how can we at DAC promote the use of technology pilots to election officials? Obviously the state and local officials are running the elections. We're in a assistance mode, but is there a way that we can promote those pilots, do you see? Mr. Dyer, you can go ahead first.
Yeah, I think what Dr. Bagga and Byers, apologies if I mispronounced your names, have talked about their comprehensive system is really fascinating and I think could be a model for other states to consider. We of course have accessibility requirements, but I don't think it's to the extent to which this protocol kind of endorses or does choose not to endorse a specific machine. I know in Minnesota, when we've tried to do something akin to a very small scoped pilot, it's been quite expensive and it's been done not through the county or the state, but by nonprofits partnering with other organizations, things like that, trying to get the counties to voluntarily cooperate as far as like lending machines, that kind of thing. And so if there's any kind of funding mechanisms for that to take place, that would be enormously helpful. That would be the one thing that I could see is that money's been a barrier for us to do that at the local level.
So this is Luann. I think this is an area where election officials could reach out to organizations of, disability organizations. The NFB, for example, has an affiliate in every state in the District of Columbia. Each affiliate has a convention every year. So, this is a place where you could get a lot of blind people in one place at one time, and, bring in some machines and do some testing. The American Council of the Blind also is another organization that, election officials could work with, the Centers for Independent Living. So, it's possible by working with those organizations, you can get a broad cross-section of voters with disabilities and try out the machines, test the machines, see which ones people prefer. And so, that's just another really great opportunity that election officials have to work with voters with disabilities.
So related to that question, when I think about pilots across the country, I think in the past years, we've seen ballot delivery systems, accessible ballot delivery systems. And I'm a big believer that we should test those for usability, accessibility, and security. And so Dr. Bagga, Dr. Byers, do you have any thoughts on that? I'm not sure if you test those ballot delivery systems in Indiana, but I'm a big believer that should also be tested to make sure. I know we did a little bit of that in Florida when there was a large number of ballot delivery for UACAVA and for voters with disabilities. I think that's important. Could you comment on that? And although EAC isn't engaged in the pilots, I think that in some ways it would be good to have the EAC test those systems to make sure they meet their potential. Dr.
Thank
Bagga?
you. Yeah, so we do not test the ballot delivery systems per se. That's done by the state of Indiana and of course by the individual jurisdictions, UOCAVA and such. But VSTOP would be happy to get involved in some of those ideas in our protocol with the state and with working with EAC. Another couple points I want to mention, going back to your previous question about how EAC can help with the accessibility related issues in states. We mentioned, it was mentioned by Luann and others early on, that training is a big part, training of poll workers for accessibility related systems. Of course, VSTOP would be happy to work with EAC in organizing training of poll workers within the state of Indiana. And we have done such training quite a bit online and virtual training. And I'm going to ask Dr. Byers to talk about a program that we have here called SEEDS Certification for Election Technology that he will talk about. And we do projects by participants. We are currently in our third cohort. But Dr. Byers, I'll ask you to speak
Sure.
to that. But there is one more thought that I wanted to add there, and I'm sure that's true for many states. Within Indiana, the Clerks Association, for example, has meetings twice a year or regularly. And at these Clerks Association, and there are two within Indiana, the Southern Clerks and the Northern Clerks, and election issues are always to the fore. Those are discussed, and clerks are given presentations. So I think it would be great for EAC and VSTOP to work together, or bringing in people from EAC and other experts in assistive technologies to make presentations to clerks at these conferences. And those, I think, would help and raise the awareness of the clerks and the jurisdictions, which can then filter down to the actual training. So those are some of the ideas, I think, where we can work together to raise the awareness of each jurisdiction at that level. And I believe ID would be interested in promoting that too. ID and VSTOP have made presentations at these Clerk Association meetings in the past. And I think the Clerks Association would welcome such presentations. Dr. Byers, if you could,
Sure.
do you want to talk about the SEEDS program a little bit?
Yeah, just briefly, for the last 3 years, we have been running a program called SEEDS. It stands for the Certificate in Election Administration Technology and Security, and it's a year-long program. And we're now in our third cohort. Each cohort has somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 15 participants, and they're all county election officials from the state of Indiana. And in that program, we cover a number of different topics in the 3 phases of the program. part of this, what is included is usability and accessibility when we talk about the certification process and things. And also we have workshops where vendors bring in equipment for purposes of demonstration, interaction, and we address it at that moment as well. But we also have at the end of the program a capstone project, and we've had students who have opted to do something in the area of usability and accessibility. And I'd just like to give you one example, and that was from Allen County. Two of our participants worked together and they completed a project called Get Out the Accessible Vote, American Sign Language video, where they proposed to construct a video or develop a video for the County Election Board website to encourage visually and hearing impaired citizens to register to vote and to come out and vote in the elections. And they worked with the National Association for the Deaf, and it included sign language and the like. So we do have those kinds of things going on here, and it's very exciting to see.
Oh, I'd definitely like to hear more about that. One of the things I heard about the VSTOP program in Indiana was that your local election officials they're basically trained on how the certification of voting systems work. So they're immersed into the understanding that. And of course, part of that is accessibility. And that's something I'd love to be able to do here at the EAC. And we'll reach out to you, get more information. Sounds like a great recommendation on these issues. So to conclude our conversation, we've had a lot of discussions. I'm going to open it up for just a final round of any recommendations you would have to election officials or to us as a federal partner on improving voter access for people with disabilities. I know it's a broad question, but it's an opportunity to just, are there any other things that you have that you recommend that we work on to improve access for voters with disabilities?
If I may add another recommendations to the ones we already proffered, Chairman Palmer, in addition to the clerks meetings, there's also Indiana Administration's Conference, that's Administrators Conference that is organized by the Indiana Election Division. So Brad King and Angie Nussmeyer, the two co-directors of Indiana Election Division, manage that conference. And that's a conference that's held in Indianapolis, and all the clerks and several local election officials are invited. There are hundreds of participants, and vendors bring in their equipment for demonstration too. We think that would be a great venue for EAC to make a presentation on such assistive technologies and features, because then everybody from the state, from all jurisdictions are required to be there and are present. So that would be a good central venue to do it, and it's done usually around the middle of December, before the holidays. So that would be an interesting one, where then the word can get out to the Clerks Association too, and then VSTOP makes presentations about certification there. That's how we made our clerks aware, that a point that you already alluded to. Our clerks in jurisdictions are very aware of our certification protocol, and they know what to expect when a vendor talks to them. So I think this would be a great venue also.
And we also field questions from the counties as well on certification when they have things that they need to know or they're curious about. So they'll call us or email us, and we'll have conversations with them.
Great. Mr. Dively?
Yeah, thank you. I think kind of a 30,000 foot question is we are seeing an increase in folks with disabilities voting, which is awesome. It's still not where we want it to be, but it's on the upward swing, which is great news. What we've done is really targeted outreach to register people to vote, to be, really taking kind of a systemic approach to this. So there's a lack of information about voting, why it counts, why it matters, like just really big philosophical points. And so we've done targeted outreach to the deaf community. We do maybe 10 or 15 regional outreach events. We do targeted outreach to the blind community, to the deafblind community, really trying to ensure with trusted messengers that are part of those disability communities, typically in partnership with other advocacy or nonprofit organizations, because frankly, we need those people's perspectives in our elections, as a really big philosophical level. But in order to do that, whether it's the county or the state level, websites and registration forms need to be in more plain language. They need to be accessible, workable with screen readers. These are all established laws and expectations, but don't actually necessarily happen in practice. And so what the upstream effect of that would be is if we were to increase the number of folks with disabilities voting, that makes that more and more of a front of mind issue for people who administer elections, because that population is increasingly present at the ballot box. And then there is kind of a tangential secondary thing where we saw the increase in mail-in voting and absentee voting. And that is a whole different kind of accessibility challenge, whether it's using support providers, personal care assistants, or, et cetera, and ensuring that those folks are trained about the nonpartisan nature of their work and how to support someone without, influencing their ability to vote independently and things like that. So there's kind of some newer challenges and newer things to address that have come up in the more recent elections than in the past. So.
Thank you. Luann Blake?
Sure. Thank you, Chairman Palmer. So I want to talk about electronic ballot delivery and return. As Mr. Dively said, more and more people are voting by mail and absentee. More states are moving toward all vote by mail. Federal law requires that there be an accessible way to vote absentee. And for the 2020 general election, about half the states provided such an accessible way to vote absentee. So it's the wave of the future. And we really need both accessibility and security guidelines for these systems. Right now, all the vendors have is the web content accessibility guidelines, but the WCAG doesn't really speak to the really special and unique needs when it comes to voting. So we really need something to address accessibility of these systems when it comes to voting, because they're here, they're a reality, and people are using them. I've been using electronic ballot delivery myself since 2014 or 2016 for a long time, and it's a great way to vote. And it's a way that I can vote absentee privately and independently. Of course, another really big issue around that is the return of the ballot. That process is not fully accessible for most voters with print disabilities. Most states require that the ballot be printed out and mailed in. So more work needs to be done on how ballots can be delivered or returned securely electronically. And then that needs to be incorporated into these delivery systems. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. And of course, verification of the voter is something that goes kind of hand in hand with that. And how are those voters verified? And what's a 21st century way to really verify a voter? I don't think it's comparing signatures. But there are other ways it can be done. So those are, areas that we really need to be worked on, because things are moving forward very fast in those areas. So we really need some guidelines so that we can be sure that these systems are accessible and secure, and we can have confidence in them.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree that it's one reason I just think that if there's a system out there that's being used in the election community and it's tied to the internet in any way, there's always a chance that there's some vulnerability to that. And for voter confidence, it should be tested. The states make policy decisions, localities make the decisions that they do. Sometimes judges order certain voting process to take place. And I'm not sure we are in a position to pick and choose what we test, but that's my thoughts. any other thoughts? That's a really good way to end this conversation, unless there's any other input on that, on those particular points about some of the latest technology that the states are employing. Any other comments before we wrap this up?
Well, if I may, Chairman Palmer, along with the points that you made and that Luan made about technologies that are out there that are going to be used, we are happy to note that VBSG 2.0 is starting to incorporate some of those end-to-end systems and such, which also take into account the accessibility, voting securely end-to-end and safely for all voters, including the disabled voters. So I think things are moving in those directions, and there's a lot of technology out there. It's a matter of acceptance also, how the community and the election community and the general public accepts and trusts those systems, the end-to-end systems. So we are in challenging times, but also in exciting times as VBSG 2.0 gets approved and is implemented, hopefully in the near future. I think there'll be some interesting solutions that'll come to the fore. Thank you.
So Dr. Bagga, Dr. Byers, I'm going to follow up a little bit on that question. You mentioned the end-to-end part of the implementation of VBSG 2.0 and its potential to help voters with disabilities and general accessibility across the board. That's going to take a lot of hard work between EAC and NIST and other federal partners. Is that something that you would recommend, that there be a whole of government approach to making sure that the end, because it's very complicated for those protocols. Do you recommend a whole of government approach to making sure that those end-to-end protocols are developed appropriately?
Well, I think a lot of research has gone into those end-to-end systems, and there is a big community out there that's a proponent of that, and further research is called for. As you said, these are hard issues, these are hard questions, but having VBSG 2.0 incorporate that and looking further into it, I think is a good step. And the more states hear about it, we will see more acceptance down the road. Of course, there'll be a few in the community that will have to be early acceptors. You always need those. As the number of early acceptance goes up, there'll be, in general, more acceptance. But it's a slow process, getting the states to move from something they've been used to something very new and very different. But I think we are moving in that direction.
Thank you. Well, I want to appreciate all of you. Thank you for your time, Dr. Bagga, Dr. Byers, Mr. Ively, Luann Blake. It's always good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me today, and have a good day. I appreciate everything you did in 2020, and as we move forward on this, I thank you for your input on this executive order. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Yes, nice to meet you all as well.
Nice meeting you. Take care.